Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, no end in sight to the massive wildfires in Los Angeles County, now known to have claimed the lives of at least 24 people. Investigators, meanwhile, say they're trying to determine what sparked those blazes. Reports emerge of a breakthrough in the talks in Doha between Israel and Hamas. The outgoing US President Joe Biden says he wants a ceasefire in Gaza before he leaves office next Monday. Plus, we're going to be getting reaction to our interview with Donald Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton. In particular, we'll be examining the president-elect's claims on Greenland and the Panama Canal, plus his refusal to rule out using military force to take control of both territories. Hello and welcome to the programme. We're going to begin in California, where investigators are trying to determine what caused a series of massive wildfires which have resulted in the deaths of at least 24 people. Well, thousands of homes and businesses have also been destroyed in the Los Angeles area. Well, lightning, which is the most common cause of fires in the United States, has been ruled out as the cause for the Palisades and Eaton fires. Well, local authorities say they're examining all possible theories, which include arson and faulty electricity cables. But what is clear is that high temperatures, extended drought and strong winds have created the perfect conditions for these kinds of wildfire. Well, there's a growing sense of frustration, especially amongst those who are desperate to return to their homes, as they had little time to pack up during the evacuation process. Well, for others, they don't even know if they have a home to go back to.
I want to collect my dad's ashes, which we had to leave behind, as well as my grandma's ashes, which we also had to leave behind. We were evacuating horses from the ranch where my mom teaches horseback riding. So we were there once the fire started. We were there all day and we had no chance to go home.
I got here at 6 a.m. It's 11:30, and then they're not letting people in. So what people are doing is they're parking their car and coming back on the street all day. It's gotten exponentially harder to get in. Rightfully so, because of the looting. I did get in 2 days ago when the market burned down, and I had to turn around because the smoke and the visibility, and it's like you were in a ball of fire, and I turned around for my own safety.
The knee-jerk is to be frustrated, but the truth is that anybody who understands even the slightest bit about fires knows that all it needs is a good wind, and things can turn bad quickly. So I know they're doing that for everyone's safety. It doesn't make us want our belongings out of there any less, especially the cars with gas and things like that. But, you know, there's sentimental value to a lot of the things up there.
Well, Hollywood has united to help victims of the wildfires. The actress Halle Berry has donated her entire closet. Jamie Lee Curtis is pledging to donate $1 million US. Paris Hilton, whose home was destroyed by the Palisades fire, has also donated money. So too has Beyoncé, who's pledging $2.5 million US through her Be Good non-profit organization. Well, for more, we can speak now to Sean Mandell, the entertainment reporter for the New York Post, who joins us from Los Angeles. Thank you so much for joining us, Sean. If you could just start off by telling us what's going on around you.
Absolutely. It's been a very dramatic weekend, as you might imagine. There has been some good news for firefighters in Los Angeles after fires on Friday and Saturday first started to get worse, continued to get worse despite increased efforts that were being made, particularly with regards to airdrops of water and fire retardants that hadn't been able to happen at first when the fires broke out because of these hurricane-force winds. Now, those winds are threatening to kick back up again this week for the next 2 days, actually, starting today. But thankfully, they died down enough over the weekend that fires that were threatening more communities, particularly a neighborhood known as Brentwood, another one, Encino, both of which are suburban communities, but also have large contingent of celebrities who live there. Those have been spared for the moment now, which is definitely good news for all of LA. But now the question comes, what is the rest of the week going to look like?
Yeah, and clearly, as you mentioned, homes of lots of people, including celebrities, destroyed, a lot of heartbreak for a lot of people. I'm just wondering, as a reporter, what sort of stories have you been covering the last week or so?
It's been a really harrowing number of type of stories that have been coming onto my radar, and just seeing and hearing, not just as a reporter, but as a person who's lived in Southern California for the vast majority of his life. So it's everything from hearing tales of people's schools being burned down, teachers in the middle of the night finding out that they don't have a classroom to return to in the morning, to as well, hearing the way that this has affected, even though one of the major fires here, of course, affected the Pacific Palisades, which is, as you mentioned and alluded to, also the area of Malibu, a celebrity enclave. There are tons of affluent and high-profile people who live there, and yet the fires don't discriminate in terms of who the victims were. Jennifer Garner had a very heart-wrenching story to tell about, as she was spotted out giving donations and working with Chef Jose Andres's World Central Kitchen to bring food to people who are victims of the fire who've been evacuated. A friend of hers, she said, didn't make it out in time from the fire. And that is just a horrific image, a horrific thing to have to imagine. And the death toll is continuing to rise. At first, we didn't have a large, obviously any loss of life is tragic, but the numbers were not particularly high at first that we got from local authorities, which you might expect for something as disastrous as this is. It's 35,000 plus acres have been burned. But what we do know now is that the death toll is at least at 24 as of Monday morning here in LA, and that number is expected to rise. And as I said, it has affected everyone from celebrities to everyone else in the area. There are people such as Paris Hilton, who did lose her beach home, for instance, as well as a number of other individuals. But at the same time, you have people who've been here for 50, 60 years in these communities when were not what they are sort of considered to be today. So it's just crossed a broad swath of society and of LA.
Yeah, indeed. And just looking, at the entertainment industry more broadly, you mentioned some of the celebrities, and on our list, we're being told Mel Gibson, Billy Crystal, Anthony Hopkins, Jeff Bridges, some of the people who've lost their homes in addition to the ones you mentioned. And some people watching might say, okay, well, they'll probably be all right financially. But they also are just really, aren't they, the tip of an iceberg in a whole ecosystem of people involved in the entertainment industry. It includes people like makeup artists and security staff. Thousands of lives have been seriously affected, haven't they?
Absolutely. It is an industry town. We have to think of it. I think it's a foremost thing to be in our mind, is that it does trickle down to every other person who is involved in the entertainment industry. You have this is going to halt work on things, and that seems bizarre to maybe think about it in that way, but that is the economy of Los Angeles, and that has ripple effects that will go out, because there are going to be people who are unable to work on projects because of this. There are going to be people who now will be having to focus on other things, and rightfully so. But as you mentioned, it isn't just the celebrities. It is these people who, what we would call below the line, or people that many might consider behind the scenes. But those are people who really are the lifeblood of Los Angeles, because that is the majority of the entertainment industry. We think of these celebrities as these A-listers, these top lights, names and shining lights, but they are not. They are a select few. And now as well, considering the way that property values, for instance, in Los Angeles have changed over the decades, a lot of these people who have been working steadily in the entertainment industry are successful, established, as you said, whether it's hair, makeup artists, grips, directors of cinematography, long list of different roles that these individuals could have. They today wouldn't be able to afford the neighborhood that they have now lost their home in. And that is going to present a large number of problems, as well as the fight to deal with insurance and insurance claims only begins. And where are they going to live in the meantime? And how are they going to be able to get back to the work they need to do and they want to do?
Yeah, and Sean, as we've been talking, we've been looking at images of the fires. I mean, extraordinary. And those images themselves, ironically enough, look like they come out of a Hollywood disaster film. We're talking here about the value of this industry to the state. I'm told that the industry is worth about 115 billion US dollars, the entertainment sector, for the economy of California. But we're talking, aren't we, about an industry that long before these fires started was an industry in quite a lot of difficulty, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it has been a watershed moment for the entertainment industry in so many different ways, because on one hand, you have the change of technology. Ever since 2008, where streaming services really, and the web, as it was alluded to and called then, began changing the way that what is now termed content is made, that has been a big enough shift in and of itself in terms of figuring out how to make TV, how to make film, how to make it profitable. You add on top of that the dual actors and writers strikes that just ended within the past 12 months or so. That has also been, as much as every people in the guilds in Los Angeles, actors and writers and other union members and other people in the creative arts have been supportive of those strikes and are happy that with the gains that were made, the entertainment industry has not gone back to pre-strike levels in terms of the amount of work being put out. Now, that is then even made worse by the COVID pandemic, which also dramatically altered the landscape of film and television and streaming, and that cut back work before you even had the strikes. And to make it an even more challenging time, you have the issue of the future of movies. You know, cinema and TV, there's been a big question about where do movies go from here, in the sense that it is still a profit. Movies themselves are still profitable, but people are going to the movies less and less. And that with declining box office numbers around the globe and even in the US, that is an economic question mark that has been left there. And we have, of course, social media, which is unlike anything we've seen before in the era of social media, in that you have, for example, content creators, and they have their own economy that is threatening what Hollywood is putting out.
All right, Sean, just very briefly, lastly, I know you present a royal podcast called Spilling the Royal Tea. I read you've also penned an article about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle meeting victims in LA. I mean, are they affected, those two?
They are not so far in the fire evacuation zones. They are, or anything in that immediate sense. They live north, about 90 miles north of Los Angeles, in Santa Barbara, in an area of Santa Barbara called Montecito. Meghan, however, is from Los Angeles. She is from a part of town known as Los Feliz, which is a little bit west of one of the fire areas. A lot of their friends, reportedly, we're told, are staying with them, who have lost homes and who have fled these evacuations. So in a sense, they have not been directly impacted by the fires, though there are these high wind warnings that are back this week, and their area is under, where they live, is under that warning.
Okay, Sean Mandell, really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, let's get more analysis. We can speak now to John Vaillant, the author of Fire Weather, a true story from a hotter world. John joins us from Orange County, California. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. You wrote an article that was published in The Guardian on Saturday, and in it you paint a picture of what sounds pretty apocalyptic, complete with blizzards of flying embers, you describe them as. You say this is part of a much larger planetary event. Can you explain for us what you mean by that?
Yeah, over the past 250 years, as we've increased our dependence on fossil fuels, starting with coal and then moving into oil and gas, we've supercharged the atmosphere with CO2 and methane. And what we're seeing, especially over the past decade, 2 decades, is an intensification not only of earthly temperature, which I know you're really feeling in Dubai and environs, but also in fire behavior globally. So this bona fide firestorm that took over large portions of Los Angeles County a couple of days ago, and which continues to this day through this week, was replicated in Valparaiso, Chile last spring. Texas had the biggest fire in its history this past March. Lahaina, Hawaii, burnt to the ground, killing 100 people last year or 2 years ago. The same thing happened, alas, in Fort McMurray, Alberta, in the subarctic of Canada in 2016. Australia burned apocalyptically in 2019, 2020. So this is unfortunately one more flare-up rather than an isolated event.
Yeah, but we've been told on this channel, speaking to other experts like you, that wildfires are a natural and vital part of the environment's life cycle, and therefore it's not purely the result of human activity. Doesn't it mean that these fires were inevitable and would have happened regardless of what human beings did?
So, Tom, this is a really important question you're asking. And what climate change does is it amplifies natural systems, natural behavior. We all know that Southern California is wildfire prone. It's a natural part of the environment here. There are seasonal winds, seasonal fires. That's all fine and normal. What is not fine is the fact that Los Angeles had the hottest summer in its history this past summer, and followed by 8 months of drought. So now what you have is a kind of supercharged fire scenario. And that's what climate change does is, in the case of Hurricane Helene, which trashed the southeastern United States, hurricanes are normal. They've always been there, but they have not dropped a meter of rain in the mountains of North Carolina ever in history. And that's what we're seeing are these historic extremes that are driven by our dependence on fossil fuels.
Yeah, there seems to be a lethal combination of factors at work here. I mean, there's no rain forecast for the weeks ahead. There hasn't been any rain for quite some time there. You've got thousands of kilometers of extremely arid landscape, gusting winds thrown into the mix as well. Doesn't all of this sound like, you've got a lot of human beings living in a place where, in fact, they perhaps shouldn't be living at all?
Well, I mean, here's the thing, Tom. So Los Angeles County is the most populous county in the United States. It's been heavily populated for 50, 75 years. Fires have been a feature of that landscape. But in Pacific Palisades, the town, the community that burnt so totally and tragically a couple of days ago, some of those buildings were 100 years old. So that tells you that either they've just been lucky for 100 years or that the fires simply were not as intense. And if you talk to any firefighter who went through that, any long-term resident, they will all say, I've never seen anything like this. And I spoke, when I was researching fire weather, I spoke to CAL FIRE veterans, and that's the statewide fire service, one of the oldest and biggest fire, it's the oldest and biggest fire service in the United States. And these were veterans who'd been on the force for 25 years, and they were describing the Reading fire tornado of 2018. This was an EF3 tornado generated by wildfire, and none of them had seen anything remotely like that. And it was, 38 degrees at 6 p.m. The night that tornado that emerged out of the flames and destroyed a significant part of Redding, California. So, this is new. And so what it's saying, though, is that we need to rethink where we live. We need to rethink how we build. But above and beyond all of that, we need to rethink how we power our civilization.
Indeed, and it sounds to me as though you're saying this is the face of things to come. We're going to have more and more of these types of phenomenon.
If we don't decarbonize, absolutely. And a certain amount of this misery is already baked in. But the sooner we transition away from climate-changing fossil fuels, the sooner we can start to restore some semblance of balance. We are in a world out of balance right now. And I know Dubai is almost a poster child for that. It's intolerably hot in the summer. It's almost lethally hot in the summer. And without air conditioning, that city would not function, could not exist.
There's this massive investigation underway in California to get to the bottom of what triggered those fires in the first place. Lightning apparently is the most common source of a trigger of wildfires. That's been ruled out. I mean, what looks to you like the likeliest cause?
So Tom, you got almost, I think, about 9 million people in the Los Angeles County area. And we engage with fire in all kinds of ways that we don't even think about. Our cars are filled with explosions as they power us down the road. Our mufflers on ATVs, motorcycles, and cars can get fire hot. Sparks are thrown by tools. Sparks can be thrown by static electricity. It is so dry in the hills around even where I am in Orange County, south of LA, that you could drop a match and get a fire going. You could drop a cigarette and get a fire going. There are claims of arson. That can't be ruled out. That's a possibility. But arson doesn't drive catastrophic fires any more than a dropped cigarette does. There are many, many fire sources amongst 9 million people, and it could have been any number of things, and it's probably a combination, of the above.
And in terms of how the fires have been managed, we've heard a lot from the President-elect Donald Trump, who on his Truth Social platform has been pointing the finger at local officials in California, accusing them of incompetence. He said, quote, "They just can't put out the fires. What's wrong with them?" Do you think it's realistic to think that people, these fires can be put out given the scale that they're on? Or is this just nature taking its course, and is nature going to prove to be stronger than any effort to try and douse those flames?
Well, first of all, for the future leader of the country to be scoring political points off a lethal tragedy in the most populous state and the most populous city in the union is reprehensible. And as far as being able to put the fires out, the aerial crews now working on this fire, helicopter and airplane, are the best in the world. But they cannot fly when it's blowing 130 kilometers an hour. You simply can't operate safely that way. That's what was happening when the fires ignited. Since then, they have been building perimeters of fire retardant and fire breaks around the fire. They've contained a lot of it. That could all come undone tonight, though, because more Santa Ana winds are predicted to blow, 100 kilometers an hour. And that drives embers. And those ember barrages that we spoke of at the top are what really set cities on fire, because they will fly over any fire break. And when it's this dry, they'll ignite off almost anything that's flammable. And so this is going to be a very hairy 24 hours.
Yeah, and of course those embers can travel very large distances. Just lastly, I mean, these reports of fire hydrants and reservoirs running dry, I don't know what you make of those reports, but does it sort of paint a picture of a scenario that could have, this could have been much less serious than it has turned out to be? Could more have been done?
So, Tom, when it's blowing 120K, water won't even work on a fire like that. And, fire weather, I kind of unpacked how unstoppable these fires are. I call it 21st century fire. And when it's burning with this kind of energy, these fires are effectively unfightable. You have to wait until the weather changes. But there's, as far as these fire hydrants, when you live on hilltops, as people in California do, and as people in Fort McMurray do, the fire I described in fire weather, you have to pump water to get up there. But if all the houses are on fire and you have huge fire crews up there pumping water into the fire, you are going to tax those pumps and tax those reservoirs in an unnatural way. The other thing that people don't think about, and that this is a really important detail, when you burn 1,000 houses, it doesn't turn the water off. All those water mains that run into each one of those houses is still running at full blast. And that will drain a reservoir or max out a pump or dry a hydrant very, very quickly. And so I'm not saying there aren't problems with Los Angeles infrastructure. Every big older city has problems, but this was a catastrophic event.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. John Vaillant, thanks again.
Thanks, Tom.
Now, there are reports that there's been a breakthrough in the ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas. Well, in what is his final week in office, the US President Joe Biden has spoken with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu by telephone. And in their conversation, Biden is understood to have stressed the immediate need for a ceasefire there in Gaza before he leaves office next Monday. Well, mediators Qatar have handed Israel and Hamas what's described as a final draft of a ceasefire and hostage release agreement designed to pause the fighting, which, according to the health authorities in Gaza, has claimed the lives of more than 46,500 people. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Mick Mulroy, the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East during the first Trump administration. Thank you very much for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. How encouraged are you by these reports of a breakthrough in the talks in Doha?
Well, good to be with you and your audience. I would hope everybody would like to see a ceasefire in Gaza. So I want to be encouraged. Of course, I think there's fair reason to be somewhat skeptical because we've seen in the past an over-optimism when it comes to these agreements being close to the finish line when they then fall apart. But I do think because Hamas is isolated, very isolated now with essentially the defeat of Hezbollah, the ejection of Iran out of Syria, and the incoming Trump administration, which is really putting pressure on Israel to come up with an agreement before he takes office on January 20th. I think all the factors would lead to this being the most optimistic time that we could get to an agreement. Okay,
so for those who are watching and who are thinking to themselves, this notion that a deal is closer than ever, for them, that it feels like a real déjà vu. We've heard this on countless occasions during the last 15 months. You're saying that something is new and that there is cause for some optimism at this stage.
Yes, I think that's fair. And I think we're seeing both the current administration in the United States, Biden administration, and the incoming Trump administration working together, essentially putting pressure on Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu specifically, to come to an agreement. He, of course, has political issues. He's concerned that the far right of his coalition may pull out, but he's also concerned that he wants to start on a good foot with incoming President Trump, who's made it clear that he wants to see an agreement before he takes office. So I think there are factors that are different than the past. Skepticism is still, I think, a fair thing to have. But I would hope that with all the pressure right now on Israel and Hamas, of course, to have a ceasefire, that we could get one before 20 January. So this week, in some time, we could see an agreement that could see over 30 hostages released and a substantial increase in humanitarian aid into Gaza, which is sorely needed.
Yeah, because the 20th of January, obviously Inauguration Day, as we've been saying, does feel like it's become a bit of a de facto deadline for some sort of a result from these talks. Let's just be clear, and you did mention that, but I just want to emphasize this really for the benefit of our viewers. We're talking here, aren't we, about a pause in the fighting and not a complete end to the war, aren't we?
That is true. It's in a phased manner. So the first phase would see a specified agreed upon amount of hostages come out. It's not the full amount. It's primarily women and elderly, non-IDF soldiers, for then a certain amount of Palestinian prisoners to be released. They would also have the Israelis move out of some of the population centers, but not out of Gaza. And of course, it would have a specified number of trucks that would be delivered into Gaza for humanitarian aid. And that would be in the first phase. If that works, then they would negotiate to go into the second phase, which is more prisoners, more of the IDF presence out of population centers, all the way to, as you said, a permanent ceasefire if they get to the final phase. But this is just to get into a pause and into the first phase.
Okay, and in terms of who's involved in the talks, and you've alluded to this as well, there are members of the incoming Trump administration who are present at the table, and that's obviously important for continuity's sake. But what sort of a difference do you think a new US Secretary of State is going to make to the situation? I mean, what does he bring to the table?
Well, of course, it's presumed, or the designee is Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, who sits on a lot of the key committees in the Senate. And he is very well knowledgeable, being in Foreign Affairs and in the Intelligence Committee, and I believe the Armed Services Committee, in all the aspects that would be necessary, being the Secretary of State. So I think he's going to have somewhat of a smooth transition, certainly compared to some of the other nominees by President Trump who haven't had that much experience, as Senator Rubio. And of course, he's coming in with the clout of President Trump behind him. And when it comes to Israel, the relationship in the past, the first administration, was very good. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu would like to see that continue. So he's going to, I think, be somewhat deferential, maybe even more so than President Biden to President Trump. But I do think the policy, although there might be some differences, will be somewhat consistent. And it usually is when it comes to foreign policy between administrations, even between parties in the United States. But of course, we in the media tend to highlight the differences. But I do think there'll be a fairly consistent policy when it comes to U.S. relationships with Israel and our efforts against Iran. Okay,
and of course, some of the old sticking points have continued to be very much present in those negotiations. But do you think there has been compromise on both sides? And do you think that's going to help perhaps eliminate some of those old sticking points?
Yes, and any negotiations essentially mean compromise on both sides. If neither side's compromising, that's really not a negotiation. It's forced on the other side. And I do think, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu has to balance his obvious country. His country has different political sides. It's a democracy, just like the United States. He has to balance both sides. But in order to get these hostages back, he's going to have to concede on some of the issues. And Hamas, if they seemingly care at all about the people of Gaza, I would argue that their actions indicate they don't. But if they do, then they're going to have to concede on some aspects of what they don't want to agree to in order to get to a ceasefire, to really stop the fighting, of course, and bring in more humanitarian aid and eventually get to a path of reconstruction and some kind of diplomatic path forward. So it's incumbent on both sides, I think, to concede on some of these sticking points, if you will, and get to a ceasefire negotiation. And I think all parties that have influence on either side should use that in a positive way to get both sides there.
Yeah, and there are splits on both sides, aren't there? Because there are Hamas officials inside Gaza who see things in one way, those who are outside who see things in another. And then, of course, in Israel, splits within the government, notably these far-right elements that oppose really any deal. I'm just wondering how much of an obstacle you think the far-right could ultimately be to not just this round of talks, but the talks going forward that bring about some sort of a more permanent settlement?
Well, they certainly proved to be very influential. And I think that has been some of the reasons why in the past, even though there was a lot of expressed optimism, we didn't actually get to an agreement. The far-right coalition, Smoltrich, for example, if they should leave the coalition, it could bring down Prime Minister Netanyahu's government. So I think they have a lot of influence, but ultimately it's Prime Minister Netanyahu who is responsible to the people. It's responsible for both the hostages, recovery, rescue, and of course, the ending the war. I mean, this has had a huge tax on the population of Israel, who relies very heavily, for example, on reservists to fight the wars both in Gaza and in southern Lebanon. So ultimately, the buck stops with him. But I think from his perspective, he wouldn't be in that position if the right leaves him. So they have a lot of influence, undoubtedly, and hopefully they can see that Prime Minister Netanyahu has to lead the nation, not just any particular party. And it's in the nation's interest to have a ceasefire to recover their hostages, of which, of course, should never have been taken in the first place, and in the fighting, which has caused a great tax on the Israeli people and their economy.
Yeah, so you're saying that basically the risk of his coalition splintering as a result of differences of opinion on how to bring about a pause or a more permanent ceasefire are one of the risks. There's also this other risk, and we've had analysts on this program who've said that when the fighting stops, some of Benjamin Netanyahu's legal woes might start to catch up with him. Do you think that's a factor that's present in his mind with regards to bringing about an end to this war?
So, of course, I can't read his mind, but I would agree with your other analysts. It certainly could be a factor. If he's no longer the prime minister, then the legal issues that he had going that were paused essentially could happen. And if he's no longer in this conflict, then of course we're going to get to a point where people are going to assess fully everything that happened that led to this successful terrorist attack on October 7th, and of course whether he should be held responsible for any of that happening, and then potentially pick a new prime minister. And if that is the case, and he's no longer the prime minister, then it's assumed that the legal issues he had before would resume, and he could face the consequences of those. So I think both of those could be, just looking at it as an analyst, could be a factor in how he views the war going forward. And more important than what I think there's Israelis that think that there is a political interest in Prime Minister Netanyahu continuing this fight to remain in office. And that, of course, could be substantial when it comes to when they choose a new prime minister.
And obviously central to the negotiations, and a lot of the domestic pressure will revolve around this as well for Prime Minister Netanyahu, are the 251 people who were taken hostage, 94 of whom still held in Gaza, 34 of whom the Israeli authorities believe to be dead. I mean, what do we know about the 60 remaining presumed to be living hostages? Are there any examples, any evidence of that they're still alive?
So that's been one of the biggest sticking points in these negotiations. Even in negotiations to recover one hostage, there's usually what's called a proof of life that starts the whole negotiations, because you don't know what you're negotiating for if the individual is in fact dead. That hasn't happened in this case, and that's one of the reasons why Israel keeps hemming when it comes to going into the first phase of this ceasefire agreement, because they don't know how many are actually alive. Hamas has been saying they don't know because they would have to be able to freely move around Gaza to go to these locations to provide this proof of life, and they can't do that when the fighting's still continuing. But certainly, this is an issue that is really a main factor in these negotiations. We don't know, we collectively don't know, and it's important to point out that up to 7 Americans are still being held hostage. So America, the United States, is not just a mediator in this. We are an aggrieved party, and we have the responsibilities to recover our citizens completely, not just to help with the negotiations. So those are all factors in this, and that's one of the things that People think President Trump's talking about when he used the phrase they'll be held to pay, is he's talking about the U.S. effort to recover our own citizens. I don't know that to be true, but that's certainly one of the potentials for what he is talking about, that we take a more active military role in the recovery of those hostages. But either way, this proof of life or lack thereof has been substantial when it comes to these negotiations not actually coming to an agreement.
Okay, and just lastly, when do you expect us to hear what? What's your hunch with regards to these talks, which we understand are in a very advanced stage in Doha?
So I do think it'll come this week, potentially before the 17th is, from what I've been hearing from fellow analysts and people I know that are either directly involved in negotiations or are aware of them. But I think the date really is the 20th. If doesn't happen on the 20th, I wouldn't give up hope, of course, and negotiations should continue. I just think that is a significant milestone that if Hamas is paying attention to, they probably would want to have an agreement before then, or this could restart the negotiations from zero, actually.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Mick Mulroy, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Moving on now, in an exclusive interview on this channel, Al Arabiya News, we spoke to John Bolton. He is, of course, the former US ambassador to the UN and the former national security advisor under Donald Trump. We spoke about President-elect Trump's recent remarks and his interest in taking control of Greenland and the Panama Canal. Well, Donald Trump has refused to rule out military action to take control of Greenland or the Panama Canal. Let's take a listen to what the former ambassador, John Bolton, had to say. I started off by asking him about Trump's interest in Greenland and the possibility that the US could take control of the territory that belongs to Denmark.
Well, let me say first, there is zero chance that the United States is going to use force to do that. And the way Trump approaches issues like this, especially in such a public fashion, leads people, unfortunately, to think that the whole idea is kind of bizarre. But let me just say, I looked at this question very carefully in 2019 when it first arose, when I was national security advisor, and the United States has long had significant security interest in Greenland. We go back to World War II, just as one example. Franklin Roosevelt put American military forces on Greenland at the invitation of the local government before Pearl Harbor, after the Danish government fell to the Nazis, because of the importance of the North Atlantic convoys. In the Cold War, it was quite important. So there's a long history here. And how to resolve the current threats in the Arctic from Russia and China, especially as global warming results in more maritime passages through the Arctic Ocean, is serious not just for the United States, but for Canada and the entire NATO alliance. I think there are ways that we can have quiet conversations with Denmark and the home rule government in Greenland. I don't think it's appropriate to negotiate this in a football stadium under spotlights. And I think that quiet diplomacy is the way to go here, because I do think this serious issue needs serious consideration.
Okay, so it sounds like you don't entirely agree with the means, but do you agree with the end goal, which is, did you conclude in 2019 that, yes, indeed, the United States should acquire Greenland?
Well, we didn't get to that point because Trump blew the negotiations up. We hadn't even really started by talking about it publicly and putting the government of Denmark, democratically elected government of Denmark, in an impossible political position. This is not how you negotiate with friends and allies. It's one thing to send a signal to the Chinese and the Russians, but you don't put friends in a corner up against the wall. Look, I'd be satisfied ultimately with full American sovereignty over Greenland. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think it's important, as my former boss, Jim Baker, used to tell me all the time, keep your eyes on the prize. The prize here is security for the United States and its treaty allies, including Denmark. It's not necessarily sovereignty. We have an existing bilateral treaty with Denmark, the Defense of Greenland Treaty from 1951, that could be a vehicle. I think there are many possibilities here but it's a sensitive subject, as people I'm sure can understand. And the way you deal with subjects like that is privately.
Okay, another sensitive subject, the Panama Canal. What do you make of what Donald Trump's been saying about that?
Well, again, there's not going to be any force used against the Panama Canal. It's so typically the case. Trump takes an issue where there's a grain of importance in what he's saying, and you lose sight of the real focus because of his bizarre approach. Panama Canal is vital for American national and economic security, and really for world trade and economic prosperity in troubled times. I think many Americans, many people around the world, are concerned by the Chinese effort to gain control of sensitive port facilities and sensitive maritime locations like the operation of the Panama Canal. I do think there are issues with what China is up to, and I do think that it's legitimate for the United States and others who depend on the canal to raise this with the Panamanian government. That's what we should do, again, privately, quietly, and just make sure that Chinese operators, Chinese involvement, which should be minimal to begin with, does not pose a threat.
Former U.S. ambassador to Panama, who you may know, John Feely, told U.S. media that taking back the Panama Canal would require a war. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, it would require steps the United States is not going to take. This is Trump blowing steam and trying to confuse people. His supporters say this is good negotiation technique. I think it's bad negotiation technique. You don't put the government of Panama in this kind of trouble. Look, last week, the president of Panama said he wanted to work with the United States to cut off the flow of illegal immigration from South America, people walking through Panama to get to the Rio Grande border between the U.S. and Mexico. He said that America's natural border is the Darien Gap. And for Donald Trump, who thinks illegal immigration is one of his biggest priorities, this is a statement, really remarkable statement by the president of Panama that showed a willingness to work with us to address the problem of illegal immigration. I hope Trump hasn't blown that up as well. It's one thing to be the center of attention, which Donald Trump always likes to be. It's something else to accomplish your objectives, and you shouldn't let your self-esteem get in the way of getting those objectives. Again, keep your eyes on the prize. Let's work with Panama on this Chinese operator question. I think we can resolve it.
And that was John Bolton speaking to me there. Well, let's get some analysis on what he said. We can cross to Daniel Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, essentially the top US diplomat responsible for Europe, who joins us now from DC. Ambassador Fried, thank you very much indeed for joining us. You were listening in there to what John Bolton said, and I want to start by asking you if you agree that it's unlikely that force will be used to take control of Greenland or Panama, as John Bolton said.
I think it is unlikely. Donald Trump ran for president on a platform of getting the U.S. out of wars, not starting new ones. The notion that he would involve the U.S. in a costly war, which would end up in an occupation in Panama, and attack a NATO ally, Denmark, is a stretch at best. I think John Bolton was right. Trump likes to come in and overturn the table as an initial negotiating tactic. He likes to be the center of attention. And what he said last week has complicated U.S. objectives, probably set them back, and what purpose is achieved, I cannot say.
It sounded, talking to John Bolton, as though he doesn't exclude this Greenland idea, but what he disagrees with is Trump's communication and methodology here, his negotiating methodology.
Well, the problem is there is no reason at all why the United States needs to grab Greenland in 19th century style. What problem is Trump trying to solve? There is a security issue with the Russians and potentially the Chinese. The United States has military access to Greenland based on the 1951 agreement that Ambassador Bolton mentioned. So what problem exactly is Trump trying to solve by threatening Denmark? Where has Denmark and where has U.S.-Danish cooperation over Greenland fallen short? And if it has, Trump has not made the case. He hasn't even attempted to make the case. So what is the purpose of threatening Denmark? If there is an issue of inadequate implementation of the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement, well, let's address it. The Danes have said they're willing to address this if it is a problem. I don't think it is. Now, on the question of Panama, there seems to be a genuine issue about Chinese influence, Chinese infrastructure in Panama. So let's deal with let's work with the Panamanian government about that. But by putting governments in a position of having to defend their sovereignty, Trump makes it harder for them to work with us in a constructive fashion. It's not remembered, but it ought to be, that in 1964 there were anti-American riots in Panama over ownership of the canal. Senator Barry Goldwater, hard right wing, supported Jimmy Carter's efforts to return the canal, to give the canal back to Panama. And he did so because, as he said, his words, if we don't, we're going to be faced with guerrilla warfare. Now, this was a hard-headed, America First reason for not trying to continually occupy the Panama Canal in perpetuity. Barry Goldwater was right. John Wayne, who also supported the Panama Canal Treaty, was right. So I don't understand what President-elect Trump is trying to do. I'm in general agreement with Ambassador Bolton that it doesn't make any sense. And if there are issues with respect to Greenland and the Panama Canal, let's deal with those issues rather than overturning the table and then pretending that it's clever negotiating strategy.
Yeah, indeed. Panama is, of course, an ally of the United States. The president of Panama admires the United States and has expressed so on numerous occasions. But with regards to these Chinese concerns at the operating level of the Panama Canal, do you think those concerns are, in fact, legitimate?
I'm not enough of an expert in Panama Canal issues to be able to render some kind of judgment. If there are issues, the incoming administration needs to articulate them more than they've done, which is just sort of throw out accusations without any backup. If there is an issue of Chinese infrastructure control or ownership in Panama, okay, let's deal with that. But it's a massive and unproductive distraction to start talking about invading Panama to seize the canal. This sort of stuff doesn't work. The United States put such expansionism aside when in 1918 and then after, it started championing a different way to advance American interests in cooperation with other countries. Now, despite all of America's blunders and mistakes and hypocrisies and inconsistencies, of which there have been many, American strategy of a new type, right? Sometimes it's called the rules-based order, but let's just call it a free world order, has worked out rather well, especially when we adhere to it. So going back to the 19th century is not apt to be productive. It puts us in a collision course with countries that otherwise, as you say, would be looking to us in friendship and willing to work with us.
So sort of more broadly, Ambassador Freed, I mean, listening to some of what sounds like expansionist rhetoric coming from Donald Trump, and I should add Elon Musk, who looks like he's going to be a key feature of the second Trump administration, threatening Canada, making it the 51st state of the United States. I mean, what's your overall reading of this approach to foreign policy? What's the plan? Is there a plan?
I have two levels of answer. On one level, this is President-elect Trump trolling and making himself the center of attention and throwing things out and watching people scramble. So it's designed to gain some tactical advantage, to throw other countries off their game, and to create confusion and an atmosphere of intimidation to see what he can get. At a deeper level, Donald Trump seems to believe that a zero-sum world of power politics in perpetuity is better for American interests. I don't think so. I think that the genius of American strategy was that we would actually work with other countries, not because we were naive or not because we believed in charity, but because we believed that this would allow us to advance our interests more effectively. And the world that America built after 1945 demonstrates that that new theory of international relations, where we would work with other countries and thereby advance our interests, pretty successful, I would say. Trump wants to overturn that, and I don't think he will make it.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but really appreciate you speaking to us, Ambassador Daniel Fried. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.